Welcome to the North Highland Line, one of Scotland's most scenic railways, and a route which, for its designers, supporters and builders, also proved to be one of Scotland's most challenging railways. It stretches from Inverness in the south to Dingwall, where it divides and turns west, to begin the 2.5-hour journey to Kyle of Lochalsh on Scotland's Atlantic coast. Returning again to its dividing point, the line travels 180 miles to Wick and Thurso on Scotland's northernmost coast. It is a stunning line, but scenic beauty is only one part of the North Highland Line's story. First and foremost, it was built to open up the Highlands. And as the journey unfolds, we will see how it brought with it new commerce, new settlers, and new ideas. The route covers an area and period in history which saw immense upheavals in the Highlands, from the decline of the clan system to the new landowners and industries that took their place. We will travel over land they travelled, land they worked and fought for, land that many were forced to leave behind when they sailed for the far-off Americas. And the story begins in Inverness. In November 1855, the Inverness to Nairn Railway was opened, thanks in large part to the determination of Joseph Mitchell, an engineer who had worked with Thomas Telford. Mitchell was not the first to recognise the potential of Inverness's strategic location. It had always been a linchpin in the Highlands, and as early as 565 AD, when St Columba came here, Inverness was the capital of the Pictish kingdom. Probably the most recent evidence of military occupation is at nearby Fort George. It was built 11 miles northeast of Inverness to replace the fort destroyed by the Jacobites in the run-up to the final, decisive battle of the 1745 uprising, the last battle to be fought on British soil. The battle where the Jacobite cause, the clan system, and the Highlanders' hopes were finally crushed. Culloden. The Jacobites had been pursued into the Highlands by George II's troops, led by his son, the Duke of Cumberland. They were cold and exhausted, having spent the night on a march from Drumossie Moor to Nairn, in an ill-fated attempt to make a surprise attack on the Duke's camp. But tired and disorientated by the darkness, the Jacobites lost their bearings, and only arrived as the English drums marked dawn. Their advantage gone, the exhausted Highlanders turned back to their camp in the grounds of Culloden House. The exhausted men were awoken there on the bitterly cold morning of the 16th of April, 1746, with the sound of the jangling of harness, the hauling of cannon, and the rattle of musket and pistol, as around 6,400 foot soldiers, 2,400 horses, and 120 guns came across the heather towards Culloden Moor. They roused themselves once more, with the rain and sleet flying in their faces, and their prince's orders still ringing in their ears.
Each individual in the army, as well officer as soldier, keep their posts that shall be allotted to them. And if any man turn his back to run away, the next behind such a man is to shoot him.
The moor was level, with no shelter from the wind and sleet, and not a slope or hillock to trouble the Duke of Cumberland's cavalry. The weather and the very ground itself was against them. But the prince would not be moved, even by the advice of his Lieutenant General, Lord George Murray.
I implore your highness, take the ground better suited to our clansmen by the River Nairn. Cumberland's horse will surely make short work of us here. We have no advantage on the moor. Surely your highness must see that we will all...
Eyewitness reports paint a bleak picture of the scene that followed.
The whole fury of the enemy's artillery seemed to be directed against us in the rear, as if they had noticed where the prince was. By the first cannon shot, his servant, scarcely 30 yards behind him, was killed. Frequent turns and looks the prince made to see how his men behaved, but alas, our hopes were very slender.
As far as I could distinguish, at the distance of 20 paces, the English appeared to be drawn up in 6 ranks, the 3 first being on their knees, and keeping up a terrible running fire on us. All was confusion, some breaking away, desperate to be upon the English.
We were falling where we stood, until I could stand it no longer and I was away, running, screaming with all my might.
Surgeon Granger, serving with the English troops, had a very different view.
The cannon gave our men infinite spirits. The enemy renewed their charge not only from their first battery, but from 2 others to their left. They only made our gunners fire the faster, and really complimented the enemy at least 20 for 1. The wind drove the smoke in the teeth of the enemy. Their batteries were silenced. The thunder of our cannon was perpetual.
Another story shows how the English soldiers were almost sympathetic to the Highlanders' plight.
They came running upon our front line like troops of hungry wolves. Nothing could be more desperate than their attack, and more properly received. Those in front were spitted with bayonets. Those in the flank were torn in pieces by the musketry and grape shot. As the Highlanders were completely exhausted with hunger, fatigue, and the want of sleep, our defeat did not at all surprise me. I was only astonished to see them behave so well.
In around an hour, it's reckoned that 1,200 Highlanders lost their lives. And while the victors enjoyed the spoils, Prince Charles joined the hundreds who fled from Culloden Moor. He spent 5 months on the run in the Highlands and Islands before being helped to safety to live out a life of exile in Italy. Culloden was not just a battle between the Scots and the English, but between the old Scottish order and the new, with just as many Scots fighting in Cumberland's army as there were in the Jacobite troops. The old clan loyalties were gone, and the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought a pace of change that no one could have predicted. The Highlanders' battle now was for survival, and supporting the new railways was seen as a way to win the fight against poverty and unemployment. Bringing the railway to the Highlands was a costly and tortuously slow business. Owing to lack of funds, difficult terrain, and often difficult landowners, the railway was built piecemeal by a variety of railway companies. It is largely owing to the vision of private supporters and far-sighted citizens who ploughed their own money into the project that the railway was ever completed. There was a kind of pioneering spirit among the railway faithful. Nothing, it seemed, could dampen their enthusiasm. When wealthy families wanted to visit their Highland estates, for example, but the railway hadn't yet reached them, they would simply transport their horses and carriages by rail, step off the train wherever it terminated, and finish the journey by road. When the railway really took hold in the Highlands, Inverness became a major engineering depot, playing a vital role as a distribution point, particularly during the First World War. During the First World War, Inverness was identified as the key distribution point for ammunition supplies for the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow in Orkney. In May of 1915, word came that work must begin immediately on a section of line leading from Inverness station to the harbour, where the ammunition would be loaded aboard ships. And they meant immediately. Trains carrying the vital ammunition from the south had already left and were on their way to Inverness. Miraculously, with just 100 men from the Royal Engineers to help him, the chief engineer completed the line in only 2 weeks. Around 160 miles down the line are Wick and Thurso. As the train leaves Inverness at the start of its journey there, it crosses one of the first of many landmarks which illustrate the beginning of a new era in the Highlands, Thomas Telford's Caledonian Canal. This is the northern end of a 60-mile stretch of waterway, which joins a series of inland lochs, cutting diagonally across the Highlands of Scotland. Telford is a name we will hear a lot of throughout this Highland journey for his work in improving communication and transport here. During his lifetime, he brought roads and bridges to the Highlands and designed many of the planned fishing villages of the East Coast, which his patrons hoped would bring new industry to this work-starved area. Already, the rest of the country was in the grip of the Industrial Revolution, and one of Telford's friends, a fellow Scot named James Watt, was playing a major role in that revolution with his new invention, the steam engine. Telford's Caledonian Canal, his roads and his bridges, were to help bring that revolution a little closer to the Highlands. Across the Bewley Firth, and within sight of Inverness's edge, is the Black Isle, bounded on the north by the Cromarty Firth. Travelling on into Ross and Cromarty, we are about 3 miles southwest of the line's dividing point at Dingwall. Here, the line crosses the River Connen. The original bridge was built by Thomas Telford in 1809. It served road traffic to Dingwall for 150 years and was only replaced in the 1970s. But before Dingwall, we reached the town of Strathpeffer. In the 18th century, sulphur and mineral springs were discovered here, and before long, Strathpeffer was attracting visitors in their hundreds to take the waters, including foreign royalty. In fact, the spa town proved so popular that by the end of the 19th century, the resort had 5 mineral wells, a rheumatic hospital, a pump room, and its very own branch railway line, the Strathpeffer Spa Express, linking Strathpeffer to Dingwall, with strict instructions to drivers to avoid sounding their whistles on this stretch of the route so as not to startle the horses. It was back in 1868 that the Dingwall and Skye Railway had first suggested taking the railway from Strathpeffer to Strome Ferry. But local people who valued their privacy and peace, notably one, Sir William Mackenzie of Coole, complained so bitterly and opposed so vehemently that the railway was obliged to skirt the village by 1.5 miles. But, as was to happen time and again throughout the line's journey and its history, a new generation discovered the benefits the railway could bring. So it was that on the 3rd of June 1885, with Sir William Mackenzie the Elder now safely in his grave, his son gave permission for the railway to go ahead. In fact, he was so enthused by the railways, he even rode the footplate on the inaugural train. Just down the line from Strathpeffer is the town of Dingwall. The line reached here on the 11th of June 1862, and it is still the dividing point for today's North Highland Line. Dingwall was once a Viking settlement and takes its name from Old Norse, meaning place of parliaments. From here, the line hugs the coastline of the Cromarty Firth and carries on towards the village of Evanton in Glenglass. This was a planned village, founded in 1810, one of several planned villages on the northeastern coast of the Scottish Highlands, designed to bring industry and employment to the area. Heading on up the Dornoch Firth, the railway reached the village of Tain in June 1864. This was the birthplace of the Christian missionary St. Duthus and an important centre of medieval pilgrimage. But today's visitors are more likely to come here to catch a glimpse of Scotland's elusive ospreys, which visit Loch Eye every summer. Still heading northwards, the line is now entering Sutherland country, the Vikings' southern land, and the ancient country of the Sutherland family, who have done more than any other to shape this area throughout the years. Perhaps one of the most controversial figures in that history is the first Duke of Sutherland. Confusingly, the first Duke of Sutherland only gained that title for the last 6 months of his life. During his lifetime he was known as the Earl of Stafford. He was not the only landowner of the time to realise that the farming of sheep was far more profitable than subsistence crofting. But he remains one of the most controversial, not so much for his motives, but for his methods. In 1813, he appointed James Loch in charge of his estates. And during a period that came to be known as the clearances, he forcibly evicted families who had been making a meagre living from the land for generations. In their place, he put sheep and lowland shepherds who could afford the new rents. Perhaps the most infamous of these incidents took place further down the line at Strathnaver and Kildonnan. In the year 1813, James Loch emerged from the inn at Golspie to read an eviction notice to the tenants of Strathnaver, who had travelled many miles in winter weather to hear of their fate.
Notice is hereby given to the tenants of Strathnaver and others on the old estate that Lord and Lady Stafford have directed that all the grounds from Carnackie on the north and Dunvegan on the south side of the river down to its mouth is to be lotted out among them, and in which every person of good character will be accommodated.
Ironically, the notice was read to the crofters in English and had to be translated into their own native Gaelic. But its message was unmistakable. Young, the Duke of Sutherland's agent, did not act immediately. There were delays, and the tenants lingered for as long as they could. It was June before the agent's men arrived, and the burnings began. Most of the men were away in the hills, tending to their cattle when the Duke of Sutherland's men arrived. And so it was mostly women, children, and those too old to defend themselves who were in Strathnaver that day. It was a day that was to be remembered long afterwards by men and women who had been children at the time of the evictions.
I took my brother on my back, and through the river I went. The water was that deep that when it came upon his back, he commenced crying and shaking himself on my back. And I fell, and he gripped round about my neck, and I could not rise no more. We were both weeping, and took fright that we would be drowned.
For some days after the people were turned out, one could scarcely hear a word, with the lowing of cattle and the screaming of children marching off in all directions. Everything was burnt that they could lay their hands upon. I shall never forget that awful day. One of James Loch's most bitter and eloquent opponents was Donald MacLeod, a stonemason from Strathnaver who wrote passionately about this period.
Every imaginable means, short of the sword and the musket, was put in requisition to drive the natives away, to force them to exchange their farms and comfortable habitations for inhospitable rocks on the seashore, and to depend for subsistence on the watery element in its wildest mood. The country was darkened by the smoke of burnings, and the descendants were ruined, trampled upon, dispersed and compelled to seek asylum across the sea.
Some were removed to coastal villages to eke out a living from the sea. Others left for the factories and mills that were springing up in cities like Glasgow. But still more were forced to leave their native Scotland altogether. They sailed aboard overcrowded, disease-ridden ships where conditions were said to be worse than slave ships. And they sailed never to return. The area of Caithness and Sutherland, which the North Highland Line passes through, covers around 3,000 square miles. It can be rugged, barren land, and it is not difficult to appreciate how the railway revolutionised this area, bringing bridges, communications, and the hope of work. During the 1860s and 70s, Sutherland's 2,000 square miles was opened up by the railway, thanks in great part to the third Duke of Sutherland, who formed his very own Sutherland Railway Company in 1865. With his backing, work was begun to extend the line from Ardguy to Golspie. It took 3 years to complete the 36-mile stretch. Hardly surprising when you consider that, instead of taking the simpler coastal route, the Duke deliberately opted for the wild, mostly uninhabited route towards Lairg, in the hope of bringing industry and prosperity to these areas. While Telford had bridged the Kyle of Sutherland at Bonner, the railway companies bridged it at Kilrain, with the construction of a very costly viaduct, 5 stone arches and a girder span of 230 feet. Until 1917, it cost just a halfpenny to cross the Kilrain viaduct to Invershin. At one time, this was the cheapest third-class single ticket in the country. The line then moves on into Caithness, an area that covers 700 square miles and makes up a third of the Highland region. It's a region of great geological interest, which until around 10,000 years ago was covered by ice. Advancing and retreating over the centuries, the ice gouged out the area's dramatic landscape. It left behind small lochs and land that rises from peaty, waterlogged moors to soaring peaks. But although this makes for spectacular scenery, it also made for very hard work for the builders of the railway.
The iron road is a hard road and the work is never ending. Working night and day on the iron way. You're a sweeper, upper, brewer, upper, shovel slinger, spanner bringer, learning how to keep 'em rolling.
After a steep climb up the east side of Achany Glen, the line travels through major rock cuttings until it reaches the village of Lairg at around 500 feet above sea level. Situated at the southern end of Loch Shin, Lairg is the point where roads heading north and northwest meet. Here, the line turns eastward again and onto the coast. Descending around 7 miles, the line follows the River Fleet down through what is now the Strath of Fleet Nature Reserve area and on to the Dornoch Firth, where there is a level run along the coast to the town of Golspie. This is the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Sutherland, who have their home in the fairy tale castle of Dunrobin. Evidence of their influence is all around here, in the street names of the coast-planned villages, in the statue of the first Duke, which dominates the area from the summit of Benvragi, and in the railway itself. As well as owning his own railway company, the third Duke of Sutherland actually had his own station and private line at Dunrobin Castle, as Queen Victoria was to find out on a visit in 1872. Friday, September the 6th, 1872. At 20 minutes to 4, we reached Dingwall. The position of Dingwall, in a glen with hills rising above it, is extremely pretty and reminds me of a village in Switzerland. After this, and passing slowly Tain and St. Dothus, we thought, as we did not stop, that we would take our tea and coffee, when suddenly, before we had finished, we stopped at Bonner Bridge, and the Duke of Sutherland came up to the door. He had been driving the engine all the way from Inverness, but only appeared now on account of this being the boundary of his territory and the commencement of the Sutherland Railroad. Golspie remained the terminus of the Northern Railway until 1868, but just 2 years later, the Duke began surveying work on the northward extension of the line to Wick and Thurso, hoping to keep costs down to around £4,000 a mile by using a narrower gauge. At this point, the railway crosses Loch Fleet on the Mound, a 900-metre embankment designed by Thomas Telford, which involved the reclamation of over 1,000 hectares of land. The line now travels on to one of Sutherland's largest villages, Brora, and on again to Helmsdale, at the foot of the Strath of Kildonan, where the Northern Railway line terminated in 1870. A year later, the Caithness Railway Company and the 3rd Duke of Sutherland's Railway Company finally joined forces as the Sutherland and Caithness Railway. Together, they began work on the stretch of line between Helmsdale and Wick, a distance of some 59 miles, 1 furlong, and 2 3/4 chains. Work began on the line from Helmsdale in November 1871 and continued into the summer months, when, after their day's work was done, many of the navvies would while away the long evenings by panning for gold in the local burns, hoping to recreate Kildonan's gold rush of 1868. On the 7th of July 1874, the lines from Wick and Helmsdale finally met. Just 2 days after the last sleeper was laid, the ever-enthusiastic 3rd Duke of Sutherland became the first to use the line when he drove his own engine and carriage from Dunrobin Castle to Wick. The 75-mile journey took 4.5 hours. The trip could probably have made speedier progress, but there was a great spirit of celebration on the day, and several stops were made to share the carnival atmosphere. The Highlands and the railway itself were becoming increasingly popular, with a new wave of tourists eager to visit this beautiful country. Indeed, some stations were built expressly to serve the country estates of the Victorian gentry. Hunting and shooting parties became very popular, and it seemed that anyone who was anyone, from painters, poets, writers and sightseers, was beating a path to the Highlands. From the village of Helmsdale, the railway turns away from the coast again and heads inland, following the Strath of Kildonan and the River Helmsdale, past lochs and over the moorland and flow country of Forcenard and desolate Altnabrec, and on towards the junction at Georgemas. From here, the line heads east again to Wick on the coast. This is a rugged area on the border of Sutherland and Caithness, where the line travels at a height of about 780 feet above sea level. Once again, the line follows an indirect route, past Loch Watton and the River Wick, in order to open the inland areas. The town of Wick, which takes its name from the Norse word meaning bay, is the most northerly town on the east coast of Britain. Over 1,000 ships once fished the rich herring waters from this town, and the industry really began to flourish when the British Fisheries Society commissioned Thomas Telford to design the model village of Pulteney Town. It was once said that you could walk from Wick across the harbour to Pulteney Town, stepping from boat to boat, never getting your feet wet. But successful though it was only with the arrival of the railway that the fishing trade here reached its commercial peak. Trains made it possible to transport herring from the ports to the markets quicker than ever before, so it arrived in better condition and fetched better prices. But this was an arduous life, and no one has better captured the dangers involved in fishing these waters than one of the area's sons, the author Neil Gunn. He wrote with passion and knowledge of the ordinary folk of this coast, from Helmsdale and Wick, from Thurso and beyond to the islands. Perhaps one of his most famous books centres around the herring fishing and the men who took out their boats in search of the elusive silver darlings.
Lads who had been fishing at the far point came running with the magic cry, "Herring!" There was excitement then. Then, fathoms away, there was a gleam from a solid silver bar. And now the silver bars formed in banks of show that swayed in living mass, throwing off spindrift of elfin green light. The crew's excitement increased as the weight called forth their strength. Slowly and carefully, now steadily, here they come. And they came in their companies, fluttering up out of the sea, the silver darlings.
Oh, the work was hard and the hours were long, and the treatment sure it took some bearing. There was little kindness, the kicks were many, as we hunted for the shoals o' herring. Oh, I earned my keep and I paid my way, and I earned the gear that I was wearing. Sailed 1,000,000 miles, caught 10,000,000 fishes. We were sailing after shoals o' herring.
Returning to the line's northern junction at Georgemas, the North Highland Line turns inland, cutting across country towards the north coast and Thurso. Sheltering round a sandy bay on the Pentland Firth, Thurso was once a Viking stronghold, and, like Wick, takes its name from the Norse. It means Thor's River. In the Middle Ages, this was the main trading port between Scotland and Scandinavia, and this area still has more in common with Scandinavia than with the land to the south. Ferries to Stromness in the Orkney Islands leave just 2 miles along the coast, at Scrabster. This crossing began in 1856 with a wooden paddle steamer. But the Highland Railway Company took over the contract in 1877, and they ferried passengers to the islands on a steamer named John o' Groats until 1882. Orkney itself is made up of around 60 islands, rich in folklore, archaeology and history. From the Neolithic burial chamber of Maes Howe, with its Viking graffiti, to the astounding Stone Age village of Skara Brae, frozen in time. And 50 miles ahead are the Isles of Shetland, closer to Norway than to Scotland's mainland. Like the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands have had their fair share of settlers, from Picts and Celts to Norsemen, and visitors still come here in their hundreds to watch seabirds, to fish, to walk the clear beaches, and to enjoy the pure air and long summer evenings. Returning again to the line's dividing point at Dingwall, the line heads north up the Cromarty Firth and turns westward to begin the journey to Kyle of Lochailsh on the west coast, travelling past lochs and across moorland. The line was built by the appropriately named Dingwall and Skye Company, and as with the line to Wick and Thurso, the main reason for its construction was a practical one: to provide faster transportation of produce from farming and fishing communities. But, like the other branch of this line, it passes through some outstandingly beautiful scenery, and soon became popular with visitors and sightseers. The company originally planned to terminate the line at Kyle, with ferries to take passengers over to Kyleakin on the Isle of Skye. But because shareholders reneged on their agreement to buy shares in a ferry, the company was forced to terminate the line at Strom Ferry, 10 miles short of Kyle of Lochalsh, and had to provide its own ferries. By 1877, this had proved too costly, and the Dingwall and Skye Company was then bought over by the North Highland Railway. But the passengers kept coming, and their enthusiasm grew. One passenger who rode the footplate on this journey, travelling eastbound, left this enthusiastic record of his trip. Still slowly eastward we travel, passing Loch Scaven with its 2 trim islets to reach the summit of 644 feet above sea level. Then in easy grades drop past Loch Gowan, enter the valley of the Bran and cross the river just as we enter Achnasheen station. Here there is a large hotel alongside the station, owned by a Mr. McIver, who has a descendant connected with a Glasgow dance hall. It was this man who refused Queen Victoria a change of horses when she went to visit Loch Marie because it was the Sabbath. We continue to descend easily down Strathbran, which means Valley of the Drizzle, a somewhat inappropriate name in the context of the heavy rain falling at the time. And so into Achanalt, from where the line drops steadily to pass the Falls of Groody, rise over a spur of rock and fall to the Conan River, which has been well fished by drivers, legally and otherwise, on the lonely section to Loch Luchert station. Here, the triplet daughters of the station master came aboard, bound for Dingwall Academy. What the railway people in the area don't know about gossip and local history is precious little. The landscapes here, around Loch Garve, are outstandingly beautiful, with the Torridon Mountains all around. But it is steep country, where fierce gradients and wet weather proved a real test for drivers and their engines as they ground their way up to Loch Luchert at the summit of the Corrymulla. From the silver birch and Scots pine of the Forestry Commission's land around Glencairn, the line passes close by the Nature Conservancy Council's Altnan Carnan Reserve, and the remnants of the Caledonian forest of Achnashellach. And with Loch Carron in view, the line is now on the west coast proper. This is a tranquil sea loch, with the village of Loch Carron stretching along its north shore, sheltered from the Atlantic by the island of Skye. And in the distance, Kishhorn and the beautiful Applecross Mountains. When the extension from Strom Ferry to Kyle of Lochalsh was finally built, it proved to be a very expensive one, thanks to arduous rock cutting through Torridon sandstone. But as usual, the railway was not to be beaten by the terrain, and the extension was opened on the 2nd of November 1897. From here, the line runs low and level along the loch before climbing towards Ploughton, a planned fishing community built in the 18th century, blessed by the Gulf Stream and made lush with palm trees and subtropical plants. 100 years ago, the last few miles of the line from Ploughton to Kyle of Lochalsh were the most expensive miles of railway ever built in Britain, thanks to embankments, rock cuttings, and a station that had to be blasted out of sheer rock at Kyle. But the effort was well worth it. Passing beyond Balmacara and following the coast, there are superb views across the inner sound to the Cuillins on Skye. 2.5 hours after leaving Inverness, the line comes to rest at Kyle of Lochalsh, where the journey ends, or begins. From here, it's only a short crossing to Kyleakin on the Isle of Skye. Just 50 miles long and 30 miles wide, Skye is filled with the echoes of Scotland's history. Vikings, Gaels, clan chiefs, and Bonnie Prince Charlie himself. A host of castles and attractions wait to be explored. You may choose the Aros Visitor Centre, where you can follow the story of Skye from 1700 onwards, through an exhibition and superb audiovisual show. Or you may prefer to explore the ancient stronghold of another clan, the MacLeods, whose chief, MacLeod of MacLeod, still lives at Dunvegan Castle. The castle is also home to the famous fairy flag, which, it is said, has the power to save the clan from disaster. Or you may prefer to experience the magical effects of the water of life at the Talisker Distillery, where the famous malt whisky is produced. However you choose to spend your time here, it is sure to be a trip to remember, just like the North Highland Line itself.
Varm binnen hoigeren gold nam bujallen se gavaloren sen stoppen urachke
From Inverness to Wick and Thurso in the north, and to Kyle of Lochaulsh in the west, we have travelled across superb scenery and daunting terrain. The line remains as a magnificent tribute to the determination of the people who believed it could and should be built, opening up the Highlands to commerce, industry, and to visitors who come from all over to travel the North Highland Line. Journeys by rail on the North Highland Line or West Highland Line offer a unique travel experience. You can even combine the two by going from Kyle to Skye via the North Highland Line and returning on the West Highland Line from Armadale to Mallaig and beyond. If you would like any more information on the dramatic North Highland Line or the historic West Highland Line, please contact ScotRail's marketing manager at Caledonian Chambers, 87 Union Street, Glasgow.